Check this out.
Oh!
That's another 40.04.
432.17 ounces.
Most people had already written Duncan Creek off. They said it was done. Over. A gamble no one would take. But Rick Ness refused to walk away. And now he's revealing a $120 million gold strike that blindsided everyone. For years, people doubted him. Experts called it reckless. Critics said he was chasing a pipe dream that would ruin his career. The numbers didn't add up. The claims seemed dead. And everywhere Rick turned, skepticism followed. While others chased quick wins on safer land, Rick stayed behind, digging where everyone else had quit. And what he uncovered wasn't luck. It was proof that patience and perseverance can transform what the world calls finished into something legendary. This season isn't just about gold. It's about rewriting the story of Rick Ness, how a place that was once a cautionary tale became a 9-figure triumph. Before we dive in, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and stick around, because this is one reveal you don't want to miss. Duncan Creek wasn't simply overlooked, it was openly dismissed. A claim people joked about when they needed an example of ground that had already given everything it ever would. Serious miners drove past without slowing down. Reports were clear. The gold was gone. Whatever value it once had was buried in the past. On paper, the outlook was brutal. Declining yields, spotty recovery, numbers that barely justified fuel costs, let alone a full season. Whenever Duncan Creek came up, the conversation usually ended with a warning. So when Rick Ness showed up again, it didn't look bold. It looked desperate. A man returning to ground that had already beaten him, with no fanfare, no announcements, just equipment rolling in quietly, almost like he didn't want the creek to notice him yet. The doubt hit instantly, heavy, unrelenting. This wasn't a comeback people were cheering for. It was a gamble most believed would fail the same way it always had. Rick felt that pressure from day one. Years of setbacks had reshaped how the Klondike saw him. Not as a rising force or a risk-taker, but as someone whose moment had passed. Bad seasons lingered longer than the good ones ever did. That reputation didn't stop at the outsiders. It lived within the crew too. Morale wasn't broken, but it was guarded. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. Another miss here wouldn't just cost gold, it would cost belief. Instead of pushing back against the narrative, Rick ignored it entirely. No arguments, no explanations. He narrowed his focus until the noise faded out. While others followed trends, Rick trusted instinct. Nights were spent alone with old records, faded maps, handwritten notes, forgotten cut lines that didn't match modern layouts, marks left behind by miners who lacked today's equipment but understood the creek when it was still raw. What Rick started to notice wasn't failure, it was interruption. Work that stopped not because the gold ran out, but because the tools of the time hit their limits. That's when everything shifted. This wasn't a last chance. It was unfinished business. As Duncan Creek's history came back into focus, patterns began to emerge. Old records hinted at zones that were never fully tested. Early miners recovered gold easily at shallow depths, then suddenly stalled when recovery dropped off. Everyone assumed depletion. But the deeper Rick looked, the less that explanation made sense. Why would gold vanish so abruptly? Why did nearby ground stay productive while this creek went silent? The spreadsheets said one thing, the geology said another. Subtle anomalies suggested the gold wasn't spread thin across the surface. It was sitting deeper, locked beneath layers early operations couldn't reach efficiently. Duncan Creek hadn't been exhausted. It had been misunderstood. Rick stopped viewing it as a surface operation altogether. He began seeing it vertically, layer by layer. Each past failure no longer looked like a warning, but a clue. The creek wasn't a mistake. It was a puzzle no one had finished. Every abandoned cut, every half-worked section pointed to something untouched below, not because it lacked value, but because it was out of reach. By the time machines lined up for deeper work, Duncan Creek had already changed, not in appearance, but in meaning. What once symbolized doubt now carried pressure, the weight of something unresolved demanding action. And for Rick Ness, recognition wasn't enough. It required commitment. He moved before the numbers ever gave permission. Stripping began where others had stopped. Intersections long avoided for being risky or inefficient were opened up. This wasn't cautious mining. It was confrontation. Overburden came off deeper than planned. Cuts widened beyond conservative limits. Machines ran longer than any safe model would suggest. Every extra foot burned fuel. Every decision stacked risk onto an already tight season. Costs surged. Invoices piled up. The budget began bleeding quietly. Not panic, just steady unease. The crew felt it. Long days delivered little visual payoff. Gold totals lagged. Cleanups felt too small for the effort invested. Concern crept into conversations. Not blame, just awareness. The clock was ticking, and the ground hadn't revealed its secret yet. Rick heard it all and didn't flinch. He didn't reassure. He didn't pivot. Retreat was the one option he refused to consider. Walking away now wouldn't just end the season. It would confirm every doubt that followed him back to Duncan Creek. This was the moment critics were waiting for. So Rick pushed harder, more stripping, deeper cuts. He committed fully, knowing that if he was wrong, he'd be wrong in full view. But if he was right, one breakthrough would erase years of doubt in a single moment. Then, the shift came, but not in fireworks or headline moments. There was no sudden jackpot, no dramatic reveal. What changed was quieter, more dangerous. Consistency, pointing in the right direction. Gold started appearing where it shouldn't have. Every projection said those layers would be thin, transitional at best. Yet pans kept coming back heavier than expected. Not enough to celebrate, but far too consistent to dismiss. The real signal wasn't the volume, it was the texture. The gold wasn't wispy or scattered. The flakes were thicker, denser. Heavier pieces began settling into the concentrates, slowly changing the mood of cleanups from frustration to focus. The crew noticed before Rick said a word. Test runs confirmed it. Different cuts, different days, same result. The gold wasn't flaring up, it was staying put, and that mattered more than any short-lived spike. Luck burns fast. This didn't. Wash after wash reinforced the same message. The ground was holding. Rick didn't stop to celebrate. He pushed forward. Cuts widened instead of closing. Stripping continued deeper instead of pulling back. Rather than chasing gold, Rick let the gold dictate the plan. With every bucket, the ground spoke more clearly. This wasn't surface pay scattered randomly, the way most claims behaved. It was stacked, vertical. Each depth carried its own fingerprint, its own weight, as if the creek had been gathering gold patiently over centuries, instead of relying on a single event. That realization changed everything. This wasn't a streak you followed until it vanished. It was a system you unlocked. Rick began mapping Duncan Creek differently. Distance mattered less than depth. The gold told a story of long-term deposition. Heavy material settling into protected layers, sealed beneath overburden that earlier miners didn't have the tools, time, or patience to defeat. Duncan Creek wasn't poor ground. It was locked ground. A natural gold trap formed under conditions no one had properly challenged before. Every bucket reinforced it, not because each load was spectacular, but because each one fit. Coincidence disappeared. Continuity took its place. The crew stopped asking if gold would show up again and started predicting where it would appear next. Wash plant numbers stabilized. Recovery stopped swinging wildly and settled into a rhythm that felt intentional. The kind of rhythm miners spend entire careers searching for and rarely find. What once looked fragile and temporary revealed itself as something far more powerful and far more valuable. A system, one that didn't reward speed or surface confidence, but depth, pressure, and persistence. Duncan Creek stopped acting like a gamble and started behaving like a design. And once Rick saw that, the question wasn't whether the risk had been worth it. It was how long the ground would take to prove him right. That proof didn't arrive in one explosive cleanup. It arrived quietly, through numbers that refused to break pattern. Week after week, the wash plant outperformed projections that once felt generous. Recovery stayed steady even as cuts shifted and depths changed, confirming structure, not chance. Figures were checked, then checked again. Crews waited for the drop that never came. Instead, the gold kept coming, measured, repeatable, controlled, as if the ground hadn't suddenly changed, but had simply begun revealing rules it had always followed. Belief spread without speeches or celebration. Conversations shifted. The defensive questions disappeared. No one asked if the gold would run out tomorrow. They asked how much more ground could be opened before freeze up. Hesitation turned into urgency. Operators sharpened their focus. Breaks shortened. Shifts stretched longer. Not by order, but by instinct. Walking away felt like leaving something alive behind. Daylight blurred into artificial light. Time stopped being measured in hours and started being counted in yards, moved, and buckets run. Duncan Creek's reputation didn't collapse overnight. It eroded, then vanished all at once. Labels like dead ground and cursed claim no longer matched what everyone was seeing. The ground didn't feel hostile anymore. It felt owned, claimed in a way that went beyond paperwork. Cuts went deeper and cleaner. Adjustments happened in real time as the system revealed itself layer by layer. Each successful run reinforced the same truth. They weren't chasing gold anymore. They were managing it. As the season pushed on, totals grew large enough to force recalculation. Then, recalculation again. Numbers were reviewed at night and rechecked in the morning. Gold weights climbed past Rick's previous best seasons, not narrowly, but decisively. Combined totals from years that once defined his career were now being matched and then exceeded by a single operation at Duncan Creek. Even under the most conservative estimates, the conclusion stayed the same. The haul had crossed into nine-figure territory. Rick didn't rush to say it out loud. He understood what numbers like that did to perception, and how fragile belief could be without certainty. So he waited. He verified. He let the gold stack speak for itself. When the final figure settled, it didn't feel explosive. It felt heavy, less like an announcement and more like confirmation. $120 million wasn't a headline to Rick. It was evidence. Evidence that years of doubt hadn't been warnings. They'd been misread data. Word spread faster than Rick ever could. In the Klondike, numbers travel without permission. Skeptics who once mocked Duncan Creek went quiet. Conversations shifted from criticism to curiosity. The claim became the most talked about ground of the season. Not because of hype, but because of repeatability. Miners who'd walked past similar terrain for years began pulling out old maps, wondering what else they'd written off too soon. Rival crews revisited abandoned claims with new perspective. Ground once labeled marginal suddenly felt unfinished. The idea that gold could be locked deep in layered systems began reshaping how miners planned, stripped, and invested long-term. Rick's approach, patient, depth-driven, system-focused, started influencing decisions far beyond Duncan Creek. Strategies evolved. Risk was redefined. The belief that surface results told the full story quietly disappeared. And just as quickly, the story around Rick Ness changed with it. The comeback story replaced the failure story almost overnight. Not because anyone wanted to rewrite history, but because reality refused to match old assumptions. Rick wasn't just surviving the season, he was shaping it. Duncan Creek, once a cautionary tale, now stood as proof that vision delayed isn't vision denied. The goal didn't merely justify the season, it redefined how his entire career was understood. Beneath the numbers, beneath the chatter of the industry, the system kept performing. Layer after layer, bucket after bucket. The ground responded exactly as Rick had anticipated. Not by chance, not sporadically, but with steady, repeatable reliability. The kind that turns a risky claim into a cornerstone, and a once-doubted miner into a quiet reference point others begin studying, even if they never say his name aloud. That consistency, undeniable and patient, forced everything that came before to be reconsidered. Years that had looked like failures were suddenly reframed. Losses once chalked up to bad judgment or luck now revealed themselves as lessons in disguise. Every setback had slowed Rick at precisely the right time, allowing him to observe, to learn, to interpret data that numbers alone couldn't explain. The patience his critics mocked became preparation. The mistakes that seemed costly were groundwork, hard-earned training that taught him to see systems where others only saw surface results. Rick's career trajectory shifted quietly but irrevocably. He was no longer defined by individual seasons, but by the arc of his strategy. Duncan Creek didn't just pay, it contextualized every prior experience. Years of uncertainty weren't detours, they were the path. That understanding changed how Rick carried himself. Hunger for validation disappeared. The tension of proving critics wrong was gone. Control replaced reaction. Calm replaced desperation. Duncan Creek became more than a claim, it became symbolic. It represented patience over panic, depth over speed, and conviction over consensus. Survival had once been the goal, simply finishing another season intact. That era ended here. What came next was legacy thinking. Decisions weren't about squeezing the last ounce from a risky cut. They were about building something enduring, something that could last beyond a season, beyond a single win. Rick wasn't chasing redemption anymore. He was defining it. Redemption didn't erase the past. It integrated it. Every doubt, every whispered criticism became part of a larger story that only made sense because of the struggle that came before. Duncan Creek didn't erase failure. It reframed it. The implications stretched far beyond one claim. If a place written off for years could hold this much gold, how many other dead claims were simply unfinished? The discovery challenged assumptions across the Klondike. Depletion isn't always real. Exhaustion is sometimes just impatience, wearing data's disguise. Now, Rick controlled one of the richest active claims in the region, and with it came a strategic shift. Risk-taking gave way to calculated expansion. Improvisation was replaced with infrastructure. Short-term survival was replaced with long-term planning. Every choice was measured against sustainability, not just immediate yield. The question was no longer how much gold could be pulled this season, but how long Duncan Creek could continue producing at this level without compromising its structure. Expansion didn't mean recklessness, it meant precision. New cuts were designed with the system beneath them in mind. Depth was managed, not rushed. Equipment was upgraded for longevity, not convenience. Duncan Creek evolved from a gamble into a stronghold, a foundation that could sustain multiple seasons without burning out. It became an anchor, not a last stand. When Rick finally spoke publicly, it wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. The gold had already told the story. The numbers were verified, documented, undeniable. $120 million wasn't a projection or hype. It was fact. The kind of figure that leaves no room for argument. Doubt collapsed under that weight. There was nothing left to minimize or reinterpret. Duncan Creek entered Gold Rush legend not because of luck, but because it had been misunderstood for so long. Its story carries both a warning and a lesson. The ground doesn't always reveal itself to those in a hurry. Rick Ness didn't just prove people wrong. He rewrote the map of Duncan Creek, of his career, and of what persistence looks like when paired with patience and depth. The claim that once symbolized doubt now stands as a reference point, a reminder that sometimes the biggest discoveries aren't made by moving faster, but by staying longer.